Clinical psychology and mental health. In this lesson, we're looking at phobias. We'll go through three main areas. First, the behavioural, emotional, and cognitive characteristics of phobias. Second, the two-process model, which is the behavioural explanation of how phobias develop and continue. And third, the behavioural treatments for phobias, which are systematic desensitization and flooding. So, what exactly is a phobia? A phobia is a persistent and irrational fear of an object, situation, or activity. The key idea is that the fear is out of proportion to the actual danger. In other words, the person's fear response is much stronger than the real threat warrants. The slide also shows the three categories often referred to here. A specific phobia is a fear of a particular object or situation, such as spiders or heights. Social anxiety disorder involves fear of social situations, especially fear of being judged or negatively evaluated by other people. An agoraphobia involves fear linked to open, public, or crowded places, often because escape may feel difficult. So already, we can see that phobias are not just ordinary fears, they are persistent, irrational, and they interfere with normal life. Characteristics of phobias: behavioural, emotional, and cognitive. Behavioural characteristics are about what the person does. Emotional characteristics are about what the person feels. Cognitive characteristics are about what the person thinks. That three-part structure is very important in exams. If a question asks for characteristics of phobias, always think, what do they do? What do they feel? What do they think? Let's start with the behavioural characteristics. The first is avoidance. This means the person actively avoids the phobic stimulus. For example, someone with a dog phobia may cross the road every time they see a dog. This matters because avoidance helps to maintain the phobia. The person never stays with the stimulus long enough to find out that it is actually harmless. The second behavioural characteristic is panic. When the person meets the phobic stimulus, they may cry, freeze, scream, run away, or show some other intense panic response. The third is endurance. Sometimes the person cannot avoid the stimulus, so instead they endure it. But they do so with very high anxiety. For example, a person with a fear of flying may stay on the plane, but the whole experience is one of extreme distress. So the behavioural side is really about how the person acts in relation to the feared stimulus. Now let's look at the emotional characteristics. The first is anxiety. Phobias are anxiety disorders, so they involve a strong emotional state of tension, worry, and arousal. This anxiety can make it very difficult for the person to relax or feel in control. The second is fear. Fear is the immediate emotional response when the phobic stimulus is present. So anxiety is often the broader ongoing state, whereas fear is the immediate response to the trigger itself. The third point is that the emotional response is unreasonable or disproportionate. The level of fear is greater than the actual danger. For example, being anxious around a poisonous snake may be understandable, but being overwhelmingly terrified by a tiny, harmless spider is an example of a fear response that is out of proportion to the real threat. That disproportion is a key feature of a phobia. Now for the cognitive characteristics, which means the ways people think about the phobic stimulus. The first is irrational beliefs. A person with a phobia may have beliefs that are unrealistic or exaggerated. For example, someone with a social phobia may believe, if I say one wrong thing, everyone will laugh at me. The second is selective attention to the phobic stimulus. This means the person's attention is drawn towards the thing they fear. They find it hard to look away from it or concentrate on anything else. This is useful in real danger, but in a phobia, it increases anxiety because the person becomes hyper-aware of the feared object or situation. The third is cognitive distortions. This means the person's perceptions may be inaccurate or unrealistic. For example, a person with arachnophobia may see a spider as far more threatening than it really is. So again, the cognitive side is all about faulty thinking patterns linked to the phobia. The two-process model MARA, 1960. We now move from description to explanation. The two-process model, proposed by MARA in 1960, is the behavioural explanation of phobias. It says phobias are first acquired through classical conditioning and then maintained through operant conditioning. That is why it is called the two-process model. There are two learning processes involved. Process 1 explains how the phobia starts. Process 2 explains why it continues. Classical conditioning, little Albert. The phobia is acquired through classical conditioning. The best known example is Watson and Rayner's Little Albert study. Albert was a 9-month-old baby who was shown a white rat. At first, the rat was a neutral stimulus, meaning it did not produce fear. Then the researchers paired the rat with a loud, frightening noise. The loud noise was the unconditioned stimulus, because it naturally produced fear, which is the unconditioned response. After several pairings, Albert began to fear the rat even when the noise was not there. The rat had become a conditioned stimulus, and the fear of the rat had become a conditioned response. The fear also generalized to similar white furry objects, such as a rabbit or even a Santa Claus mask. So the basic idea is that a previously neutral stimulus becomes associated with fear. Ethical issue in Little Albert. It is also worth noting the ethical issue here. Albert was never deconditioned, which would be seen as a serious ethical problem today. So although the study is useful in showing how fear might be learned, it would not meet modern ethical standards. That sort of point can be useful when you are evaluating the evidence behind the behavioural explanation. Now we move to the second process, maintenance through operant conditioning. Once a phobia has been learned, it is maintained by avoidance. When the person avoids the phobic stimulus, their anxiety goes down. That reduction in anxiety feels rewarding. This is called negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement does not mean punishment. It means a behaviour becomes more likely because it removes something unpleasant. In this case, avoidance removes anxiety. So the person encounters the feared stimulus, avoids it, feels better, and is then more likely to avoid it again in future. This keeps the phobia going because the person never learns that the stimulus may actually be safe. That is why avoidance is such a powerful maintaining factor. Let's evaluate the two-process model. One strength is that it is supported by evidence such as Little Albert and other conditioning research. This gives the explanation some scientific support. A second strength is that it has practical applications. If phobias are learned, then treatments can be developed to help people unlearn them. That leads directly to behavioural therapies such as systematic desensitization and flooding. A third strength is the idea of preparedness, suggested by Seligman. This says some fears are more easily learned because they may have helped our ancestors survive. For example, fear of snakes or spiders may be more easily acquired than fear of harmless modern objects. However, there are weaknesses too. Many people with phobias cannot remember any specific conditioning experience that started the phobia. That suggests classical conditioning cannot explain all cases. Another weakness is that the model ignores biological factors, such as genetic vulnerability. Some people may be more likely than others to develop phobias. And finally, some phobias may be learned vicariously, which means by observing others. That is better explained by social learning theory than by the original two-process model alone. So overall, the model is useful, but not complete. Behavioural treatment, systematic desensitization, often called SD. This was developed by Wolper in 1958. It is based on the idea of reciprocal inhibition. That means anxiety and relaxation cannot occur fully at the same time. So if a person can learn to stay relaxed while facing the phobic stimulus, the fear response can gradually be replaced with relaxation. This is sometimes called counter-conditioning. Systematic desensitization is a gentle, gradual treatment. It does not throw the person straight into the most frightening situation. There are 3 main stages in systematic desensitization. First, the therapist and client create an anxiety hierarchy. This is a list of feared situations arranged from least frightening to most frightening. For a spider phobia, that might begin with seeing the word spider and end with holding a spider. Second, the client learns relaxation techniques. These may include deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation. Third, the client goes through graduated exposure. This means they slowly work up the hierarchy, staying relaxed at each stage before moving on to the next. Exposure can be in vivo, meaning real-life exposure, in vitro, meaning imagined exposure, or even through virtual reality. The key point is that the person learns a new, calmer association with the stimulus. Now let's evaluate systematic desensitization. One strength is research support. Studies such as McGrath and colleagues found that many people with specific phobias improved after SD. Another strength is that it is patient-friendly. Because the treatment is gradual, it is less traumatic than flooding, and this usually means lower dropout rates. A further strength is that it has broad applicability. It can be used with children and with people who may struggle with more intense treatments. On the other hand, there are criticisms. One is the idea of symptom substitution, coming from the psychodynamic approach. This is the claim that if you remove one symptom without treating the deeper cause, another symptom may appear instead. However, there is not strong evidence that this happens often. Another limitation is that SD may be less effective for more complex conditions, especially when unhelpful thinking patterns play a large role. In those cases, CBT may be more suitable, so SD is widely seen as effective, especially for specific phobias, but it is not perfect for every case. The second behavioural treatment is flooding. Flooding involves immediate, full exposure to the phobic stimulus. So unlike systematic desensitization, there is no gradual build-up. The person faces the feared object or situation at full intensity right from the start.
That's it, you're doing great. Nice and steady breaths. See how gently it moves.
The conditioned fear response weakens when the feared stimulus is experienced without anything bad actually happening. So flooding is fast, direct, and intense. Flooding can happen in 2 main ways. It can be in vivo, which means direct real-life exposure, such as holding a spider, or it can be in vitro, which means imagined exposure, where the person vividly imagines the feared situation. Sessions are often long, sometimes 2 to 3 hours, and continue until anxiety begins to fall. Because flooding is so intense, informed consent is essential. The client must know exactly what the treatment involves and agree to it. This is one reason why flooding is effective for some people, but not suitable for everyone. Let's evaluate flooding. A major strength is that it can be very time efficient. Unlike SD, which may take many sessions, flooding can sometimes produce improvement very quickly, even in one session. There is also research support, including evidence suggesting it can be effective for specific phobias and that improvements can last. However, the obvious weakness is that flooding is extremely distressing. Because of that, dropout rates can be high. If the person leaves before the fear reduces, the phobia may actually be reinforced rather than weakened. Another weakness is that it is not suitable for everyone. People with heart problems or very high anxiety sensitivity may not be appropriate candidates for such an intense treatment. And like other behavioural approaches, flooding mainly targets behaviour and fear responses, not the person's deeper thinking patterns. So again, cognitive approaches may sometimes be needed as well. Overall, flooding can work, but it comes with clear practical and ethical concerns. SD versus flooding comparison. This slide compares systematic desensitization and flooding. Systematic desensitization is gradual, while flooding is immediate. SD usually involves lower distress, while flooding involves high distress. SD tends to have lower dropout, while flooding has higher dropout. The mechanism is also different. SD works through counter-conditioning and reciprocal inhibition. Flooding works through extinction of the fear response. In terms of suitability, SD is usually suitable for a wider range of people, including children, whereas flooding is usually more appropriate only for people who are able and willing to tolerate intense anxiety. So if you get an exam question asking you to compare them, focus on speed, distress, dropout, mechanism, and suitability.